Welcome back to Season 2 of That's So Second Millennium, the Catholic Science podcast, where we look forward to the new synthesis in the new millennium between faith, philosophy, and science. Welcome back to That's So Second Millennium. This is episode 80. This is a short episode. It's actually the tail end of the conversation that we had with Jonathan Lunine about science and religion specifically, before we transition to talking more about planetary science and life on other planets, which you can look forward to coming up later this month. So we talk mostly about just the culture of the faith-science divide, debate, as it's come to be understood or projected onto the issue in America versus other cultures. And in particular, Bill probes Dr. Lunine on the role of journalists in that debate. So hopefully you enjoy it.
Right, welcome back. This is the continuation of our interview with Dr. Lunine on topics. We had a great discussion about the interface between science and religion, living as a religious scientist in a culture where that is widely considered to be almost a contradiction in terms, although it varies from discipline to discipline and subculture to subculture. And that fascinating anecdote that we ended on, where you were giving a talk, I believe this was at the Knights of Columbus, a Knights of Columbus event somewhere.
Yes, that's right.
And it was a woman came up to you afterward and told that story. I mean, that in a sense that could have been me if you just deducted several years off the age of the son involved. That really kind of was my story when I was, I'd say about 12. Was that I'd really, I'd read the Bible and I'd read my, a little bit about geology and my pop-up book of the universe. And, well, these don't tell the same story with all of the,
right,
critical ability of a 12-year-old.
Exactly. And, the assumption that they both are written to the same purpose, which is the big flaw in that effort to compare the two. I went back and I looked for the book that I had referenced earlier in our interview by Elaine Ecklund and colleagues, and it's entitled Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. And the conclusion of that book, there are many interesting conclusions, but the primary one is that this perceived conflict between science and faith is a Western phenomenon. And not only is it a Western phenomenon, but it's especially an American phenomenon. And so when you go and talk, as they did, to scientists in India, for example, or other parts of Asia or Africa, that conflict is much diminished or is even puzzling. And I think that a lot of the reason for that is that people get much more of an education in their culture, their faith, and that faith is much more a part of their culture, for example, in India in particular, so that they're much better equipped to understand the way in which one needs to think about both faith in terms of one's life and how it relates to the physical world around us, and science and the limitations of science and what it can tell us and what it can't tell us. So we have to remember that as wonderful a part of the American narrative science is, it is not in fact any sort of a replacement for the things that nourish the human soul, if you will.
That opens a complex set of issues that we probably don't want to discuss today about the whole American experiment, the First Amendment, and our religious culture as well. The sort of the amazing variety of Protestant denominations and their whole range of. Yeah, there's a whole bunch to unpack there that is probably not what we want to spend the whole rest of the podcast on, but we could stick a fork in it and stick a fork in it for now, but keep it as a landmark that we might pick up again.
I have to ask just quickly, speaking as a former science journalist, I know that you've had fruitful dealings with some science journalists, including secular science journalists, I believe, Dr. Lunine, do journalists feel that they too have to present themselves as completely secular in order to have any credibility as writers on science, or do you see that there's some openness in a hopefully curious mind of a journalist to make some contact on the compatibility of these two issues?
I haven't explored this with journalists as much as perhaps I should. There's certainly some journalists who will write about science, as part of Catholic news services or Christian Science Monitor, something like that, where, there obviously isn't going to be that conflict. But, there are other journalists that I've interacted with who very clearly know a lot about science and don't know very much about religion or faith, or have no interest in it. And I remember one interaction I had with a journalist who I won't name, but is for a journalist, a science writer for a very prominent newspaper, and made this comment that was completely ignorant about church. And I emailed him and pointed this out in what I thought would be a reasonably lighthearted way. And to his credit, he said, yes, I agree with your point on it. But there are some science journalists who are wannabe scientists, for example,
right,
or who prefer to write about science rather than doing science, or scientists who are also sometimes journalists. I think by and large, most of those people have not thought carefully about the interface between science and faith, because it's really their job from their point of view to write about science, to be honest.
Yes.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can email a link to this episode at thatsosecondmillennium.net, share the post for this episode from our Facebook page, or you can use your podcast app's built-in sharing feature.